Good afternoon, and welcome to this CC conversation on the intersections of anti-Asian racism. My name is Rosalie Rodriguez. I'm the Senior Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Director of the Butler Center. And today I have the honor of moderating this diverse panel as we explore history, identity, empowerment, and healing around Asian hate. According to the organization Stop Asian Hate, since the COVID-19 pandemic began in March of 2020, anti-Asian hate crimes have increased by 1,900%, with nearly 3,000 reports in 47 states and the District of Columbia. Still, anti-Asian violence remains underreported due to fear and the complex intersections with other forms of discrimination. Anti-Asian sentiment is complicated by the way it ties into classism, xenophobia, colorism, sexism, fetishization, and even anti-Blackness. For instance, many attacks against Sikh and Muslim communities are labeled simply under the umbrella of Islamophobia and void of their connection to Asian identity, as these voices are often excluded from the narrow view of who exactly is Asian. While these recent trends are troubling, anti-Asian sentiment is not new. Today, I am honored to unpack some of this nuance with our guests. Amirani Alamillo is a 2016 CC alumna and administrative assistant in the Butler Center, where she mentors and supports students and coordinates programs such as Mind, Body, Soul, and Beyond CC. She is in the final days of completing her degree to become a licensed professional counselor candidate. Dr. Yogesh Chandrani is assistant professor of Asian Studies and Religion. His teaching and research focuses on the intersection of religion and politics in South Asia and on the history and anthropology of modern Asia. Dr. Eileen Lowe is assistant professor of English who joined Colorado College in 2020. Her primary interests are critical refugee studies and Southeast Asian American, especially Hmong American narratives. And finally, Mateen Zafer is coordinator of mentorship and diversity initiatives in the Butler Center and a licensed social worker here in Colorado. Mateen advises a number of support programs such as the Enclave Living Learning Community, Questbridge Scholars, and the Minority Association of Pre-Health Scholars, also known as MAPS. Please note that the Q&A function is available, and we will do our best to answer all questions at the end of the panel. Let us begin by starting with Dr. Chandrani. I was hoping you might start us off in our conversation today. Since the wake of the mass shooting in Atlanta that took the lives of 8 people, including 6 Asian women, there has been a nearly collective shock across the United States. Many people are wondering why all of this racism is directed at Asians all of a sudden. Others still are blaming the Trump administration's rhetoric, but anti-Asian racism is not new and not tied to one specific administration. Can you center us a bit in a common understanding of the complicated history of anti-Asian racism?
Thank you, Rosalie, and the Butler Center staff, and also the staff at ITS for making this conversation possible. There's a long history of the US's relations with Asia, and I think we should best begin there. And it is worth repeating some commonly known points that we often forget about. And that is, the first point is that racism is constitutive, not just incidental to the history of the United States. The US is a settler colony, and it is an imperial power that has since the 19th century pursued its interests in the Asia-Pacific region as an imperial power. Now, one of the features of all modern colonies and empires is that they're founded on ideas of racial difference and racism, both in their internal structures and in the way they relate to the outside world. The US is not exceptional in this regard. And from the very beginning, political elites of the US imagined themselves as successors of the European powers that had conquered the Americas. US relations in with Asia and the history of anti-Asian racism bear this connection out. So for example, in the mid-19th century, the United States joined European powers in extracting concessions from the Chinese and from the Japanese states. In this period, Asia and Asian societies were represented in very pejorative terms, for example. And people in respectable professions were at the center of producing and circulating racist views. So for those suffering from Down syndrome, for example, were described as afflicted by Mongoloidism. The physical appearance of East Asians was construed as a sign of a genetic disorder. Implicitly in these ways of naming was the idea that the white body was the image of perfection. America also inherited and reproduced other features of colonial discourse about Asia, sexualizing and fetishizing Asian women, representing them as diseased, as devious, as dishonest. And Asian men and women were collectively often represented as docile. In the 19th century, the British, who were the dominant power in Asia, and in their largest colony, India, they defined all unattached girls and women, i.e., that is, those who were not under the charge of a male guardian, as prostitutes. In British discourse, these women needed to be controlled and regulated because they were dangerous as objects of desire or morally degenerate or carriers of disease. Many of these ideas were echoed in the 1875 Page Act, the very first legislation designed to control the arrival of immigrants from East Asia into the US. In this act, Chinese women were defined as prostitutes unless they could prove otherwise. They were inspected and given medical checkups, put through a series of questions at the port of embarkation in Hong Kong, and then throughout their journey to the United States and upon disembarking. These very highly sort of charged discourses are still with us in the way that we represent immigrants today, and also in the way that Asian women are represented, a sort of an intersection of misogyny and racism. Scholars who have studied this period in American history have pointed out that the Page Act, for instance, was applied to all Asian women, and large numbers of women from all over Asia were denied entry into the US. Now, this official racism is often echoed in American society also. So, for example, the American Medical Association in the 19th century argued that Asians were carriers of diseases and germs that whites had no immunity to, and therefore they should be barred from the US. American imperial interests in Asia can be traced back to the middle of the 19th century, when the first missions were sent to Japan and China. The US, as all of you will recall, colonized the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, amongst other places. It is also worth recalling that Asia has been the continent where the US has fought its bloodiest and longest wars in the 20th century, either by direct involvement or through proxies. And in these wars, international laws governing warfare have been violated with impunity. In all of these cases, the wars were waged against societies that were either formally colonized or were targets of European imperial powers. So in other words, there is a rich history of American investment in a certain colonial project and the production and reproduction of colonial views regarding Asia. So the Korean War was waged to contain China. Vietnam was a French colony, and we invaded after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and the most recent Asian war in Afghanistan, following 9/11, which was preceded by a decade-long campaign to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. Official racism is often mirrored in society. So in 1904 at the World's Fair, 1,000 Filipinos were put on display as savages. In the 1980s, we see a recurrence of this theme with the killing of Vincent Chin, a Chinese engineer, who was killed by people in Detroit when American auto manufacturers were not able to compete with Japanese car makers because the latter were producing efficient and compact cars. And more recently, during the War on Terror, we have seen reports of the rounding up of thousands of South Asian Muslim men, the serial attacks on Sikh men, the 2012 mass shooting at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin, and most recently, under incitement of the previous administration, the murder of a software engineer in Kansas City. The last administration, of course, was explicitly and blatantly racist. But today we are dealing with a new, more liberal administration, which has in its strategic planning announced and identified China as the biggest threat to American interests. So we are likely to actually see a continuation of a kind of xenophobic discourse that'll be more subtle, but nevertheless very much present in our media, in our coverage, in the way that people think and relate to Asia and Asian bodies. So the events in Atlanta, the mass killings, should not be seen outside of this deeper, longer historical context. Okay. Many of you are also aware of immigration laws, the history of immigration laws, so the Chinese Exclusion Act, which followed the Page Act. These laws actually, and many of the assumptions governing the regulation of bodies of immigrants, are now inscribed into contemporary American immigration law, even though they don't identify any single class or ethnic group or race as deserving exclusion, except for the Muslim ban, which followed the war on terror. Many of those assumptions inform the way that immigration agencies deal with those deemed to be un-American. So it's with this background in mind that we should think about the recent wave of attacks on Asians that have taken place. The second point, which is very, very crucial, is that political discourse makes a huge difference. What our leaders say makes a huge difference. They have the power to incite violence. They have the power to also promote a better society. And we need to be always on the lookout for incitements to racism. I think that's all for now.
Thank you so much for that important history. There's so much to be covered in such a short period of time. You touched on this difficult intersection between fetishization, misogyny, and xenophobia, as well as anti-Asian racism. And I'm wondering, Dr. Lo, if you might follow up in this line of questioning. So much has been written in the past weeks about the Atlanta shooter's so-called addiction, but his targeting of Asian women specifically has been nearly eliminated or decentered from that conversation. I'm wondering, Dr. Lo, if you would talk a little bit about that connection between racism and fetishization and exotification of Asian women in general.
Thanks, Rosalie, and everyone here for being part of this conversation. And Yogesh has already laid out a lot of this historical background, right? And pointing out a lot of the ways in which, not necessarily that it's like built up to this, right? But everything that has allowed for something like this to happen, right? And the one thing that I would also add to that is the amount of microaggressions, right? That many of us face. And in particular to this question, I think it's important to note that the Asian category is vast, right? It's a political label that came out of the civil rights movement and was a way for people to try to claim power and agency after being erased for such a long time. And so it's a label that includes lots of folks, including someone like me, who is an immigrant, who is Southeast Asian, who is Hmong, who doesn't necessarily fit into, I think, the popular image of Asian America, which is often Chinese and Japanese and sometimes Filipino. And also even within the Asian American against Stop Asian American Hate, right? A lot of Pacific Islanders have not felt that they were included in that statement. And so my comments come from who I am, right? And the acknowledgement that there are a lot of different experiences out there. I do think that this fetishization of and hypersexualization of Asian and Asian American women is something that many of us face, no matter how we particularly identify ourselves, right? It doesn't necessarily stop folks from looking at our bodies and thinking that they are expendable and that they can be claimed as property. And I think that has happened to a lot of Black and brown bodies as well. And it ties into Yogesh's comments about colonization. And right, the fact that white supremacy believes that anyone who doesn't fit that category, right, can be used and can be fetishized. And for Asian and Asian American women, they've been hypersexualized, right? And as Yogesh was saying, for Asian men, they've been emasculated and seen as people who do not deserve Asian and Asian American women, right? And so the racism and misogyny is extremely linked. And with the Atlanta shootings and murders too, I think the piece that wasn't touched on was class as well. That many of these were working women who were working, especially during the pandemic, and doing a job that required, right, for them to be like very close with their customers and clients, which, you know, is not a job you can do socially distanced. So they were all risking their lives just in terms of that, right, to do that kind of job. And so I want to touch on really like media, right, and the role that popular culture has played in creating these images and proliferating them so that they just become our daily parlance almost, right? And I think this goes to both the political discourse that Yogesh was talking about, but also like the daily microaggressions that people face, right? To be being bombarded by these images of Asian and Asian women as sex workers, right? That we see in film and in TV. And I wanted to think about one particular film, which is Gran Torino, which is about, you know, Hmong refugees being resettled in Detroit, right, to link back to the murder of Vincent Chin. Yeah, and in that movie, there's the emasculated, right, Hmong young man who's fatherless and doesn't know how to behave like a man, and so the Clint Eastwood character teaches him how to be masculine. And then there's also his sister, right, the Hmong American young woman, who is at first like brash and loud and is the one who kind of brings like Walt's character into the family. But you know, she's silenced because she's raped in the film. And that triggers Walt to act as the white savior. And I think this is the one of the many dangers of this fetishization of Asian and Asian American women, right? Is that there are at once these bodies that men can use, and that men can use both in the U.S. and also in Asian countries, right? But there are also these women who then need to be saved, and who can sort of remake the white male figure as the savior. And I think that's a film where you can really see that happening at the same time, right? So I think it's not just about the violence that is enacted on these bodies, but also the ways in which these bodies can then be used to sort of propel the figure of the white savior into society and into our popular cultural images and imagery, imaginary, I should say.
Thank you for that context, and also for your willingness to make it personal, and to talk about how that experience affects you. I'm wondering, Mateen, if you might be willing to take us down this more personal route of identity and the really complicated nature that Dr. Lowe has already started to unpack a bit. For marginalized people in the US, identity has largely been imposed by governments and institutions from a white supremacist lens. For instance, the division between Europe and Asia has been defined largely on who is excluded from being able to immigrate, as Dr. Chandrani was mentioned earlier. And to Dr. Lowe's point, making Asian identity a very broad and encompassing, extremely diverse set of cultures, religions, and geographic regions. In thinking about your own identity formation, how do you factor in this broad generalization, and how is your identity developed over time? And does that change based on your location?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Asian is not really a label I used growing up in India. My family and I immigrated to the US when I was 7 years old. And when people would inevitably ask that, "Where are you from?" question, I would identify myself as Indian to my classmates and would often be asked in return, dot or feather, or some variation of that degrading question and expressions of confusion. And given that hurt I felt in not being seen in that way, I would then try to identify myself more broadly as Asian. And then the responses I would get to that would be, "You're not Asian, you're not AZN." And I think that really speaks to, well, first, I think it was really confusing for me because I know Asia to be this massive landmass with many different cultures, but I think it speaks to how often South Asians are not included in perceptions of being Asian in the US, but rather for the most part, it's people of Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Filipino ancestry that are labeled as Asian in the US. For me, I have a more of a racialized experience of being a brown-skinned person here in the US. So here I'm either seen as Black or a terrorist. And even before 9/11, I was labeled as a terrorist due to my skin color and religious background. And movies like True Lies and many others from the 90s relied heavily on stereotypes of Muslim, Middle Eastern terrorists. And the intense Islamophobia following 9/11 really kind of led me to identify even more closely with the plight of Black and Brown communities in the US and globally, given the racialized experiences I've had in the US. As it comes to your question about identity and how that changes based on location, my identity and what's most salient to me and aspects of my identity really do change based on where I am. So while in India, I might not be as conscious of my skin color, but I'm certainly present to my identity as a Muslim. I'm a religious minority in India. And so, the religious persecution my family faced was a primary reason that we immigrated to the US. And so that's something I'm conscious of anytime I'm in India. However, prior to working at CC, I worked in admissions at NYU and had the privilege to travel to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, or the UAE as y'all might know it, where NYU has a campus. And this really was my first time in a Muslim majority country. And it was the first time I wasn't othered for being Muslim. And that was really nice, where it just felt like that was part of the norm. And I felt free in a way I've just never experienced in my Muslim identity, and seeing the beauty and acceptance of a Muslim majority country in a way that I've just never been exposed to, given how Islam and Muslims are discussed in not just the US, but also in India. But conversely, it was also the first time I was really present to my internalized Islamophobia. I remember hearing the adhan, or the call to prayer, walking through the streets of Abu Dhabi, and started having this physiological reaction in my body where I just started feeling panicked. In the US, the only time I would ever hear the call to prayer would be in a mosque, in a space that felt safe for me to be Muslim and express that part of my identity. And hearing the call to prayer in a place that was so public, and to hear it so clearly, so loudly, like really triggered my fear response and kind of put me in hyperdrive. And it's just because historically I haven't felt safe to be Muslim publicly. So thank you for the question.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And you bring up some really good points about, as we think about our own community here, as we think about what our students might be dealing with, and kind of unpacking and maybe experiencing sometimes for the first time a different identity that they have to embody here at Colorado College or here in Colorado than they might have whatever state or other countries they might be coming from. I would like to ask Amrani, I mentioned earlier you're a licensed counselor candidate. I know you're really passionate about working with marginalized populations, especially immigrant and undocumented communities. You also have the distinction of being the panelist here with the longest history at Colorado College and in the Springs. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what resources are available in the local community and on campus for folks who are experiencing xenophobia and racism, and what gaps exist to actually accessing the resources that are available for marginalized communities.
So I know we will be providing the AAPI resource list that Mateen has composed, so I won't take up time listing those resources that are available. However, while there are several resources in the CC and Colorado Springs communities, I want to highlight that the resources are only as helpful as the people in those offices and the services they provide. Essentially, as an institution or a city, we may claim that we are here to support underserved communities, such as people of color, immigrants, as well as undocumented and LGBTQIA+ individuals. But the people working in those offices may not be culturally sensitive or multiculturally competent. Furthermore, the resources they provide may not take into account the intersections of identity of those they are trying to serve. So the gaps that exist in accessing those resources, for example, are the stigma around mental health, lack of bilingual services or simply services in that person's language, fear of being outed to law enforcement, disability, and lacking representation, just to name a few. If I don't see people that look like me, have gone through similar life circumstances, and understand me, why would I walk into those spaces, right? Oftentimes, walking into those spaces can be detrimental. And this is why it's so important to create our own communities and find resources within those spaces. For example, navigating CC was a difficult experience for me as a queer Latina and first generation scholar. I relied heavily on the few friends that I established since the Bridge Scholars Program all the way to my senior year. These were the people that I could be vulnerable with, dig deep into my emotions, shed happy tears, or simply vent about things. Without establishing my own community and support system, I wouldn't have been able to navigate the challenges that come with my identities, particularly when I, as a self, don't fit into the boxes that society has for me. And there's that accountability piece on myself to find the support needed, as well as the accountability from those that I trust.
Thank you so much. I think that it's so important, and you're so right that representation is important in considering how we access resources. Dr. Chandrani, I'd like to circle back to your historical knowledge and how it helps kind of focus on our current moment. One of the pervasive stories that you started to discuss earlier is how xenophobia, particularly for Asian immigrant communities, has been linked to disease and illness throughout these kind of maybe not just Western narratives, but narratives. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this phenomenon and how we're seeing it play out in our current COVID-19 discourse.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I want to point out is that the murders in Atlanta came exactly a year after Donald Trump's description of the coronavirus as the Chinese virus in a tweet on March 16th, 2020. The association of disease and Asia and Asian bodies has a long history, right? I mean, the saying amongst young British men who were off on their adventures in colonial India was that they went there to get rich and get sick. You either were going to die from an illness because you were in India, but before you died, you would at least be fabulously wealthy from the exploitation. So there is a long history of equating the Asian body with disease or portraying it as a diseased body. And a lot of that discourse has to do with positing the white body as the ideal form of the human body. This is actually not peculiar to the representation of Asians. It is actually common to the representation of all colonized peoples. So African bodies were portrayed in a very similar vein in European discourse, and so were Native American bodies. Now, in the context of Asia, the most commonly known historical material that we have is on the epidemics that swept through the region at the time that the colonial states, European colonial powers were conquering. And what gets left out of these accounts is that these afflictions are often represented in these narratives as peculiarly Asian. What gets left out is the responsibility of European powers, right? Because they altered the conditions of life. That's what colonialism is really all about, is altering the very terrain on which the colonized live. So bringing about significant transformations in the modes of production through the introduction of private property or industrial agriculture brings about significant climate impacts, as we know. And climate impacts, as we know, are connected to the proliferation of diseases. So it is not as if the modern West had nothing to do with the rise of these diseases and pandemics. But they were always portrayed as peculiar traits of Asian bodies. That's one. Second, the 19th century is also the period when medical doctors, anthropologists, and other scholars began to classify and catalog human diversity systematically. So the notion that East Asians belong to the yellow race came to the forefront. You know, in the 1700s, European thinkers used to describe South Asians as belonging to the yellow race. And suddenly now the category yellow had been shifted in space. But along with that discourse about skin color were discourses about physiology, about mortality, about disease, about genetic constitution, and so on and so forth. And Down syndrome, for example, was described as Mongoloidism, right? Which is an illness that leads to certain physical traits, but they were equated or seen as analogous to the appearance of East Asians, specifically from Mongolia. Malaria, which was prevalent in many of the tropical countries, was seen as a peculiarly Asian disease, for instance, and so on and so forth. But at the center of these medicalizing discourses, and I think that's a good term to use, was the female body, right? The Asian woman was simultaneously the object of desire and an object to be feared, regulated, and controlled. They were seen as the carriers of diseases, morally degenerate. At the same time, they were seen as victims of traditional forms of patriarchy. So there are all these contradictory threads that are running through European and American representations of Asian men and women. At the center of it is that there are certain physical, or what one would call physiological differences that cannot be transcended. And that's really the sort of at the core of this scientific racism that is emerging and that we are still implicated in to this day. I would not say that we can actually imagine living in a world outside of the legacy of this history of racism. And so when a president tweets in the way that he does, and when there are large numbers of Americans who are attracted to it, and a few that feel empowered enough to pick up a gun, that is indicative of how deeply sedimented these ideas are in our discourse, in our society, in our memories. And I wouldn't underestimate the power of this history to bring these problems to the forefront. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that context. I think you bring up an interesting point about the kind of contradiction of what we value, what dominant colonizing cultures value and find beneficial, that they're very willing to take and profit from Asian cultures, but often not very concerned about the people. And Dr. Lo, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this phenomenon. To think about the beauty and the diversity of Asian cultures, and This phrase that I use often, that's in very prevalent in marginalized identity discourse, which is everything but the burden, kind of referencing that dominant culture loves to benefit from the myriad contributions of marginalized communities, but don't necessarily love the people who contribute so much to society. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how this form of erasure and commodification is harmful, and how you found ways to resist that erasure and celebrate the beauty of Asian cultures and contributions.
Thanks, Rosalie. I mean, Yogesh might want to jump in and talk more about the commodification. I think that is key in this, right, is the exploitation and the profiting from certain things while erasing the humanity of people, right? And also of presenting a culture or a people as like monolithic, when there is, a lot of differences. And I think one thing that it also does is that it creates this narrative of scarcity, right? That there can only be one sort of like hot Asian thing at a time. And I think you can see this definitely in the food trends, right? That I think that when Vietnamese pho became a thing that everyone had to try and had to learn about and how to, it became the new ramen, as if there is no way that there can be like multiple noodle dishes out there that can be popular and enjoyed and valued for lots of reasons, right? And so there's this cycling and there's this idea, and I think this is where the commodification comes in, right? That like in order for something to be completely profitable, it has to be rare and it has to be exotic, and it also has to be detached from the people who make it, and the long history of why these food cultures develop this way. And then, to answer the other part of your question, for me, it's been really important to center the things that really change the narrative, that add complexity, right? That really showcase people as full-fledged humans who, whose daily lives are not necessarily spectacular. And I think this is why I've always been a literature person, right? Because to me, that was a space where you could see the nuance, where you could spend some time in someone else's head and walk in their shoes. And I don't want that to be seen as like a voyeuristic thing, right? Where you put on those shoes for a second and then you have the sense of, okay, now I know exactly what it feels like to be so and so. No, I think we still have to be critical consumers, right, and readers. But it's been very important for me to champion like literature and film narratives, right, that deal with complexity, that deal with nuance. And this is why I work on Southeast Asian American literature. And yes, I teach Asian American lit, right? And we approach that in lots of different ways, and try to ground it in critical thinking and perspectives. But it's been really important to me to really look at the many authors who are now emerging, who are driving their own narratives, right? So again, this is coming off what Yogesh was saying about the ways in which white supremacy has been able to control how we see people and how even we see ourselves. And the way to really resist that is to write out your story, right? And to speak on behalf of yourself, and to not let those narratives be the only narratives out there. And again, for me, that's happened through the literature and film.
Thank you. I know you had kind of tapped Dr. Chandrani, and I just want to check before we move on if you have anything to add to that question.
I actually don't have anything to add. I think Eileen summed it up beautifully, and we should probably open up once we go through talking to everyone else in this group, open up to our audience for questions.
Absolutely. We have one last thought, and then we're going to get to some of the questions. We have a couple in the queue already. I'm wondering, Mateen and Amarani, if you can think a little bit about this question about how we move forward. As counselors and mentors, you both bring a particularly important lens to what it means to heal from trauma. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what steps it takes to heal or just to sustain in kind of this ongoing trauma that folks might be experiencing, and how we move forward together as a community, kind of in solidarity with each other as well.
Yeah, so I want to start off in just defining both crisis and trauma, right? And so crisis can be any emotionally significant event or radical change of status in a person's life, while trauma, on the other hand, can be any experience that stuns, overwhelms, or alters a person, as well as one or more harmful circumstances that persistently impede the well-being and functioning. And so just to provide some psychoeducation around that, if we look at the survival response and the brain, specifically looking at the triune brain model, we have three different brains essentially, right? So there's the thinking brain, which consists of the neocortex or the frontal lobes, and it enables us to use that language, engage in abstract thought, plan and reflect, imagine and play out specific actions, as well as empathize with others. On the other hand, when we think about the emotional brain, this consists of the limbic system, and it detects danger or a special opportunity, such as finding a mate. The reptilian brain initiates that fight or flight response, and it's often based on past situations where there are those rough similarities. And so I mentioned this to also validate what are common trauma responses that may not feel like so-called normal responses, but they do exist. So this can be feeling helpless or hopeless, a sense that one can never do enough, being hypervigilant, having diminished creativity, an inability to embrace complexity, minimizing chronic exhaustion as well as physical ailments, an inability to listen or have deliberate avoidance, dissociative moments, sense of persecution, guilt, fear, anger, cynicism, an inability to empathize or have numbing, any addictions, or grandiosity, which is an inflated sense of importance related to one's work. And so I do want to validate that those exist and that it's also a journey to heal from the trauma. And oftentimes, particularly now in the world that we live in, you know, this is impacting all of us, but mainly people in these underserved communities. And so I do want to also touch really quickly on the stages of burnout. And so those stages are having this enthusiasm, which is characterized by idealism and unreasonable expectations. There's the second stage of stagnation, so feeling like one's needs are not being met. Then there's that third stage of frustration, which is where an individual questions their efficiency, their value, their impact of their work. And then the final stage is apathy, which is a chronic indifference to the situation in which an individual is in a state of crisis and disequilibrium. And I also want to touch base on secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, which is when a person that is exposed to another trauma's narrative, they may experience this disruption of their own core beliefs and symptoms that mimic that of the post-traumatic stress. And so in this work, it's really necessary to have that deep empathy and willingness to be vulnerable.
Thanks, Amarani. I really appreciate that. I know my emotional brain and reptilian brain certainly were firing as we were getting started today. I was nervous, y'all, but just wanted to touch a little bit on what we were talking about regarding moving forward as a community. And just want to share that I don't think it's our job to tell white people what to do, right? I think we need to focus on our needs as people of the global majority or BIPOC folks and navigating racial trauma and grief and work towards sustainable healing. And before I share maybe 6 different ways in which you can do that, I just really want to touch on, you know, my personal experiences with the model minority myth and how it relates to this deliberate divide that's created between BIPOC communities. And so for me growing up and immigrating to the US, I was really taught to desire this proximity to whiteness and really distance myself from Black people in order to have the benefits of white people have and to really achieve that American dream, that we're sold on as immigrants. And I was taught to find pride in assimilating to the cultural expectations of white people, and thought I would be rewarded for it. Even after 9/11, I was focused on showing white people that not all Muslims are bad. And that's really how I navigated my post 9/11 reality for a long time. It wasn't until I began my master's degree in social work that I had an education to really understand how the model minority myth really upholds and is really a function of white supremacy, and really allowed me to become present to my own privileged identities. Whereas previously, I think I was really focused on the identities that I held that felt oppressed. And through that education, I really saw in the ways I was engaging in this oppression Olympics that I think we sometimes do. And through this language and increased educational understanding, I really came to understand the idea of no one is free until we are all free, and that really building bridges and expressing solidarity between oppressed communities is really essential to healing and support and really ultimately dismantling white supremacy. So if I can give you all just maybe 6 things to think about as it comes to our own healing through racial trauma and grief. And please know that these are things that I struggle with certainly, and but I do think it's important to reiterate that nobody's perfect, and we have ups and downs as we try to hold on to these ideas. So the first thing is really to affirm and extend self-compassion, and I think we can do that by creating small practices through the day that allow us to really consciously hold and release many of the responses that we have that are really wrapped up in that grief. And having an opportunity to express self-compassion allows our emotions to have that physical release so we don't hold on to that violence in our bodies. 2, I think it's important to make ongoing healing plans, understanding that this is cyclical, that healing is cyclical, that we'll have internal and external triggers that will continuously surface in our lives, and to really be flexible with ourselves. These aren't experiences that we just get over. They are deep wounds that really do take time and unconditional healing, unconditional care to lead to healing. Third, really creating intentional alone time to unplug, whether that's social media outlets, the news, even talking with others. And while these outlets certainly, especially while we're in sheltering in place, can foster connectivity and increased awareness, they also can really contribute to the excessive amounts of stress that we have on our nervous system. So just keep that in mind that, there is never a time where you're absorbing as much or as little as you want to. It's a constant struggle to kind of feel where that balance is, but that's important for you to figure out for yourself what that is. Fourth, taking care of our minds and bodies, through healthy sleep routines, food that is nutritious for our bodies and strengthens our immune systems, and physical activities allow us to really breathe. 5, I would say, really, as you begin or wherever you might be in your work of racial activism, be gentle with yourself and allow yourself to discover your own role. Don't compare yourself to other people or where they're at, and also attune to your own passions and let it draw out in the direction that allows you to support a cause that is important to you. And also support trusted local organizers against anti-Black racism. 5th, or I should say 6th, create a good playlist. Audible inputs, they should really validate our existence. And I was in a session, in an admission session, and I was just listening to some of the songs that were coming there, and they were just so healing. And I think it's important that we create that for ourselves. And lastly, just to repeat that process. Thank you.
Martini, it's a perfect segue to one of the questions that came in, which was, what are some books or films that do a really good job of representing the complexity of Asian cultures? And this is for anybody on the panel. What are some recommendations you might have for folks for films or media that they should be consuming?
I guess I should weigh in as the literature person, right? I have a list that's way too long, so I would say if you're interested, please email me. You can just find me on the CC site, and I can also throw my email in the chat. And I would say also then take a class with me if you're a student who posted this question, because I do think that books work best when you can also have a discussion about them, right? Because I do often caution my students against reading it voyeuristically, right? And reading it to get something out of it for yourself and not really thinking about the character or what the things that are happening in the text. So I think that it is always important to be a critical reader. And to read widely and not to take one text and think that that's it. I would say that one book that I've been thinking through a lot is The Best We Could Do, which is a graphic memoir by Thi Bui. And I would say that book because part of what she's doing is she puts herself in that text, right, as a memoir. And I think that through centering herself, she allows readers to see the complexity in the histories, right? And the layers of trauma and resilience. So it's not necessarily like a feel-good narrative, right? That makes you think that everything has been solved by you reading this book and by her writing this book. So that was one that I'll throw out there, but I would say email me for a longer list and then take my class or take any of our classes, really.
Anybody else have recommendations? I know some are being dropped in the chat to folks. So you have the names down, makes it easier to find them. One probably more complex question that came through was whether or not naming white supremacy as kind of the culprit behind all different types of isms, racism, sexism, whether it be in the Black Lives Matter movement, the Stop Asian Hate movement, is not being done enough. And that is actually part of the continuation of us not being able to move forward because we're not really focusing on the main culprit, which is white supremacy. Thoughts from the panel?
I wouldn't use the phrase white supremacy. I would just simply use the term racism. Here at CC, we are embarked on the project to become an anti-racist institution, but none of us, all of us are actually products of a racialized order. We actually do not know what it means to live outside of racism. And racism is global, as W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out in The Souls of Black Folks, that the problem of the color line is the problem of the 20th century. One could say it remains a problem in the 21st century, and it is a global phenomenon. All modern imperial states organize themselves as racist states. If there is a legacy that they left, it is not just the globalization of capital, but also the globalization of racializing discourses. So it is a hierarchical, it's a system that produces a hierarchical social order. In the United States, one is supposed to aspire to becoming like white people, but it is an impossible goal, as anyone who belongs to a minority will tell you. That's one, and it's not necessarily the desirable goal for many of us. It is also a system that obscures from you certain types of violence and prevents certain types of solidarities, right? So the discourse of the model minority in the US, by the way, the global flip side of it was the long running discourse of the Asians as being docile, right? They keep their heads down and do as they are told, which is what the British used to say about Indians, that they're a docile lot and therefore only fit to be governed by force because they will not move otherwise. So, you know, these discourses, these practices are deeply, deeply sedimented, and they have a way of mutating, right, and coming back. So this is not to say that there are no historical specificities. So the experience of Blacks in the United States is historically specific to the American context. Right? No other community fears that men in their community will be gunned down simply for being Black, and gunned down legally, so to speak, by the arm of the state. No other community has experienced the genocidal history that the Native Americans have. So keeping in mind all of these specificities, at the same time, there are commonalities in the history of racialization, in the histories of racialization. In fact, one of the biggest one of the most powerful features of American political discourse that obscures this history of violence from view is the official definition of the United States as a nation of immigrants. Right? It completely depoliticizes the history of appropriation, expropriation, violence, enslavement, conquest that went into the making of the American Republic. So yes, I mean, there are two faces to this story, no doubt, and you can call it white supremacy, but I think racism is a more appropriate term because it has a way of also incorporating other peoples into its projects. Right? One should not shy away from pointing out, for example, as a South Asian, that there are members of the South Asian American elite who are willing to participate in this hierarchizing discourse and hierarchizing project, and themselves engage in racist behavior, right, or racist acts, or apologize for them. So it's a form of power. It's a way of organizing society. It's a way of imagining society. And so we have a huge battle on our hands when we say that we want to become anti-racist or we want to fight against racism, because we actually don't have the conceptual tools to imagine a world without racism. We don't have the historical experience anymore. There were societies before 1492 that certainly were not racist, but they are now in the deep recesses of our memory. How do we access that in this time? I think what we can do is think politically and strategically about building solidarity across the identity categories that are imposed on us by modern regimes of power. The American state is a classic one, right? The model minority was a cudgel used to beat back the demands of the civil rights activists, or to argue against affirmative action and so on and so forth, to undermine all of the progressive legislation. But the burden is on us to build solidarity across these lines and bring people together to defeat this monster called racism.
I did want to add to that too. I wish we were in person so we could ask more of this question. I think for me, and I think from a lot of what I read too, coming from other Asian Americans, is that it's been important to recognize the victimization because our victimization has often been erased and silenced. And not seen as real victimization, right? And so much of what like Almarini was saying too about trauma versus crisis, right, is that there's been this ongoing trauma of being gaslighted and of feeling like what we've experienced is not enough to rally against and for, right? And so some of it is recognizing that it has happened, and that there is a long history of it, even if it has been erased, even if it has been sort of papered over by this idea of the model minority. And so it, I guess I don't see the two as being separate, right? I think that talking about victimization is also talking about supremacist thinking, or as Yogesh was saying, about racism, and that every time another Black man dies, it is important for us to say that Black lives matter, because the act itself doesn't seem to be changing anything, right? We do have to keep asserting the violence that is done onto our bodies and our minds in order to address supremacist thinking.
Thank you so much for that. I think, Dr. Lowe, you bring up a really important point about how erasure is in and of itself a form of violence. And one of the questions we got was about types of violence or other types of violence that enable anti-Asian racism. And I think your description of how erasure plays into that is a really good example of the types of violence that kind of feed that narrative, because it becomes invisibilized. It is below the surface. We don't recognize that it's happening. You know, that was really taken aback that even within a lot of social justice communities, people were genuinely surprised at the uptick, or, you know, this idea that this was happening suddenly, and we're not aware that erasure is a really significant and important form of violence that we often forget because it is invisible. Thank you. I don't know that we have, I don't know if other folks have thoughts about other forms of violence that also feed into that anti-Asian racism. I know we covered a lot of the intersections of xenophobia and sexism and misogyny. Are there other things that are coming to mind before we close out, or if you have any other final thoughts before we end our session today? Well, I do want to close our session today by thanking everyone for being here, for being vulnerable, for being willing to tell your stories. I think as we were planning for this, this idea of being able to have a space where we are, as marginalized people, especially, you know, as Asian folks, able to tell your stories through your own lens, through your own experiences. I think Dr. Chandrani said both the mundane and the extraordinary simultaneously are pieces that really need to be, you know, brought to the surface and made visible so that we are better able to tackle these issues as they come up. I do want to thank all of you so much for your time and your thoughts and your willingness, again, to lend your voice to this really important conversation today. I hope everyone has a wonderful day and that you have learned something important in our session today. Thank you so much.